시작한다. The adaptation of euro and further creation of a single currency union was intended to alleviate the uncertainties with fluctuations in the value of individual currencies and inherent difficulties when converting to different currencies when within economic exchanges. Especially because of the nations affiliated to Eurozone have had a constructed experience as well as extensive history of economic interactions, the hoped for positive effect of euro single currency was prevalent in its genesis. As this single currency was implemented, however, its intended benefits were accompanied with even more costs. These costs have mainly stemmed not only from structural limitation but further because of different economic status within the member states. It triggered a situation where more economic stable nations are actually carrying the dependent, less economically profound nations, reflecting the recent cases where nations such as Britain and France continuously expressing their willingness to opt out from the eurozone, showing that the initiation of euro currency was an undesirable, and the effect of a single currency further shows that the cost outweighs the intended benefits, and hence we, the government side, views that single European currency was indeed a mistake. Before moving on to our team's substantive materials, we would first like to clarify what a single currency is. So basically, it is very important to understand what conditions would follow for implementing a single common currency. By common currency, it means to implement a unified currency with the same value and with a shared exchange rate decided by the central body, in this case the European Central Bank. In other words, nations would no longer have their own national right to decide and control upon their interest rates and currency value. Furthermore, this condition also includes free movement of capital and labor within the EU economy. This, however, does not mean that these nations have to yield their jurisdiction of enacting separate fiscal policies, which include welfare, education, and domestic stimulus packages. So with this being said, the side government has prepared mainly three arguments for today's debate. Firstly, why yielding the right to decide nations' monetary policies is actually principally wrong, and secondly, why developing nations would be harmed because of these unilateral monetary policy, and lastly, the second speaker from the government side will explain why interdependency creates domino effect in the regional economy. So let's move on to my team's first argument. So firstly, we believe first question that we have to answer is why yielding the right to decide nations' monetary policies is actually principally wrong. So let's start from our first analysis. What is monetary or fiscal policy? We believe that the monetary policy is something that the central bank decides. The central bank, such as FDR, decides so that regarding the interest rates or the bank loan rates that actually influences the money currency in the economic system of a nation. And the fiscal policy, on the other hand, is something about like the government, something that the government does. The government body and the public body actually creates bonds and sells it or buys it into the government, hence changing the money fluctuation in a single economy. So then, moving on to the second analysis, what is the result of using the euro currency regarding the fiscal or monetary policy? So firstly, we believe that the nations lose control of monetary policy in this situation. Why? Because we believe that fundamentally these common currency means that the nation is actually giving away its right to change its monetary policies to a European Central Bank, which is a one single bank that takes care of all the euros in the all eurozone areas, and we believe that this is very problematic. Because why? The nation is actually getting loose of hold of their own monetary policies, which is actually intended for taking care of their own economy. And what happens what happens if this becomes true? So maybe the opposition side may think that because these governments are actually still allowed to make fiscal policies, maybe this is not a grave problem. However, this will be further explained in the second argument, why fiscal policy is not enough, and why monetary policy, the loss of monetary control over monetary policy itself is a very harmful thing to the government. And moving on to the second analysis, we believe that in that case, the result of using euro is not only that the nations lose control of the monetary policies, but rather also they go through conflicts. Why? Because we believe they go through conflicts. And why is it so? Because we believe that fundamentally, because one single entity is taking care of a gigantic area with like tens of thousands, tens and 20 or more like nations, we believe that the interests of these nations actually collide with each other, making them go into conflicts. And we believe this is harmful for two main reasons. This is because this is against the first purpose of creating the Eurozone, and B, because it is impossible to benefit the whole European Union or the Euro nations in the Eurozone itself. So because of these reasons, we believe that firstly, fundamentally, we believe that taking away the right of monetary policy of these nations is very harmful. And is exclusive harm coming from the creation and the genesis of euro currency. And moving on to the second argument, why is euro harmful for some European nations, especially developing nations? So let's start with my first point of analysis, how developing nations used to gain competitiveness in the European society. Well, firstly, they used cheaper and lower currency, which actually enabled them to have cheaper price. Which leads on to the second point, they used tourism and trade. They had tourism and trade advantage over other countries because they had cheaper price. And we believe that this was actually how these developing nations were gaining competitiveness in their own region, in the European region, and actually this was how their economy was striving to survive in before the European currency was actually introduced. Then what happened after they decided to use euro? Firstly, they lost competitiveness. Why? Well, let me show you a scenario. They started the fact that they started using euro means that they started using a higher currency, higher than the original currency that they used to use. Then, which means that they had no choice but to get higher prices on their products, which is actually comparatively low, considered to be comparatively low quality, and which leads to low competitiveness in the Euro society. And this meant the loss of tourism and trade deficit increase, which actually led to the loss of competitiveness in these nations, in these developing nations. So secondly, they tried to survive indeed. The government kept on trying new policies and new methods so that they will be actually able to survive these loss of competitiveness. But what this actually resulted was that it actually resulted in only new debts on the government and the public sectors, which actually created a vicious cycle in itself. And thirdly, because these public sectors got debt, the problem was that because these public sectors got a lot of loans and debts, the fiscal policy became ineffective in itself. Why? Because fiscal policy is basically selling or buying bonds of the government and the public sectors, and because these public sectors have lost their credibilities, the fiscal policy lost its effect in this first place. So what have we told you today? We have told you why, firstly, the yielding of monetary policy to a third party is principally wrong, and secondly, we have told you how developing nations actually got harmed from the usage of euro in itself in the first place. So because of these two reasons, mainly the government side believes that euro was actually a mistake to create in the first place. Thank you. The vertical tips. Time much.
Christian Tom.
역시 나는 third speaker야. 나 그냥 third speaker 해야 돼. I was born to be that.
Mr. Speaker, the proposition has stated a lot of
Voice up,
problems.
voice up.
This proposition has stated a lot of problems and a lot of situations that happen of a supposed European crisis because of the euro currency, Mr. Speaker. And that they say that, well, the governments have doing their jobs, but because of the euro currency itself and the system itself has caused innate structural problems itself that cannot be changed by the governments themselves. Why? Because these governments are ineffective because of them opting in inside the eurozone and deriving their own sovereign rights, Mr. Speaker. We say that although it's true to some extent, Mr. Speaker, they haven't dealt on the fundamental reason of why this crisis happened in the first place, Mr. Speaker. It's because not of the system itself, not because this European Union itself, Mr. Speaker. It's the unwillingness of these nations to comply to the measures taken by the European Union, Mr. Speaker. And that in this case, we say that it's not right to say that it's the European currency's problem, but rather these national problems themselves.
Point,
so what
sir.
are we trying to prove in this debate, Mr. Speaker? We're trying to prove that, first of all, it's wrong to accuse the euro for all the harms in the eurozone, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, we're trying to enable us to, this euro currency enabled the EU to overcome damages, Mr. Speaker. And finally, that's the benefit. There's actually hidden benefits that the international community say that they're neglecting, Mr. Speaker. So having this said, let's look at what they have said in their arguments and that what they haven't proved in their burden of proof, Mr. Speaker. Now, what has the opposition come and said? What has the proposition come and say, Mr. Speaker? He's saying that, well, this is a systematic problem and that fiscal policies haven't been adequate, haven't been enough for the European nations to solve their situation. Hence, they haven't been able to use their monetary policy to be much more effective. We say that this is a wrong characterization, Mr. Speaker. How is that so? Because they have shown you in this debate is that it's not. They've shown you that it's not that that these policies themselves were enough, but rather they didn't show a willingness to even implement these fiscal policies in the first place, Mr. Speaker. So having this said, what they have characterized, let's see and scrutinize their points in this debate, Mr. Speaker. First of all, regarding the points of fiscal policy, now they characterize that first of all these European nations, regarding in the context pigs, that they have, in order to gain comparative advantage of their products and their industry, they chose cheap currency and in that process they had cheap products, which induced more people into the region, Mr. Speaker, to gain competitiveness. Yes, we say to some extent that yes, this is right, but the problem they characterized, the fundamental reason they characterized was because this currency itself was too high for them to gain comparative advantage. We say that this is not true, Mr. Speaker. Why is this so? Because we say that in a statistical analysis, we see that even though when the price was high, when the exchange rate was high, we see that there was still a lot of tourists and that the fluctuation wasn't happening. We say that the fluctuation occurred when the 2008 crisis hit and damaged the economic status of the US, of Canada, of China, and all these countries that had the demand of the people, had the people who go and do tourism, Mr. Speaker. That is why we say that they have a very wrong characteristic of the problem itself. Hence, the premise, as this is a premise of the situation, that is right to say that the results of what they have analyzed, the fiscal cycle caused by the lack of currency, by the lack of comparativeness, and subsequently the inadequacy of the fiscal policy itself cannot stand this debate. Even if this is true, Mr. Speaker, let's say points out the problems in their analysis of the fiscal cycle. They say that the public debt was caused by this lack of competitiveness in this nation, Mr. Speaker. No, this is entirely not true, Mr. Speaker. Why is this so? First of all, we say it was an innate problem of the industry itself that these European nations, in example Greece, was too dependent on one or two industries. In this case, tourism of the example they have given us today, Mr. Speaker. Thus, they say that this public debt was caused by the currency, but which was caused by the innate structural problem within the nation itself, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, they say that the fiscal power, the fiscal policy itself was in itself inadequate. That is because there was public debt, that they couldn't get enough money for the fiscal policy to efficiently regulate the entire system, Mr. Speaker. We say that this is not the case, as it is to say that it's not what the pigs done, Mr. Speaker, is that Let's see where this fiscal problem of this entire crisis came in the first place, Mr. Speaker. That is the fiscal. Why didn't Greece or why didn't the pig nations get the money, adequate money for an efficient fiscal policy, Mr. Speaker? It's because their inherent structural problem. Why is
Point,
that
sir.
so? That 24% of the economy of Greece itself is a black market. As to say that because it's a black market, the government can't implement taxes in order to procure the money or the interest for these to order to make an efficient fiscal policy itself. Hence, because of this structural problem, that is, it's only for the government.
Exactly, sir.
Because it's only for the government because first of all is a lack of tax money, and second of all because of the immense welfare policy that initiated caused the public debt they have characterized in the first place, and that's in the inadequacy, the lack of money for a general and effective fiscal policy, Mr. Speaker. Now, they also mentioned something about credibility. Yes, Mr. Speaker. But the problem of why they've been incredible in the first place was not because of the public debt. But, well, it could say that, yes, it could be said of the public debt, but why did they get public debt in the first place? First of all, because of the structural problem, and also because, in the case of Greece, in the case of Spain, in the case of these pig nations that are being a problem in the Eurozone crisis, that is, they have been given that they have this indiscriminately gained loans from banks, and in return they haven't given the money back to the debt loaners, Mr. Speaker.
Last
That is
point,
why that we say that there's no credibility of these people in the first place. Yes.
Isn't all the problems that you have just mentioned couldn't all the problems that you have just mentioned be solved by a single fact that if these nations were able to handle their own monetary policy, these problems won't have existed in the first place?
Mr. Speaker, we say that even if that was the case, Mr. Speaker, that these countries wouldn't have been willing to implement this in the first place. Hence, we say that the problem itself was caused by the government's inadequateness, Mr. Speaker. In the case of the example we have given to you was Greece, in which Greece himself benefited in black markets, and second of all, in the case they were too delved in their one industry, in their monopoly industry, and they didn't change the problem. They weren't willing to change the problem, inherent structural problem in the first place. That if that was the main reason, and that they didn't show willingness to solve that problem, why would they adhere and try to solve the problem in a monetary policy, Mr. Speaker? We say that this cannot be. This is a inconsistency that we can see from the opposition's propositions POY. So having this said, let's move on to our case, in which I don't have time, but I'll try to make it stable. So what the entire rebuttals we have given to you was our entire case, Mr. Speaker, and that said they have adequately shown the false assumptions that are going around inside the European crisis. That it was all because of the European currency. Hence, we're showing you that it's not the case, and it was wrong to accuse the European Union for all the harms in the Eurozone. That was our first argument, Mr. Speaker. Second of it enable the Eurozone to overcome damages. So what I'm going to do in this last 1 minute is try to analyze these kinds of benefits that occur from the Eurozone itself, Mr. Speaker, because of the Euro. First of all, there are two main benefits, economic benefits and political benefits. Regarding the economic benefits, as the government has thankfully adequately explained in the first part of the speech, that yes, it allows for the mass movements of labor, the free movements of labor, and benefits to move, capital to move across a certain society, Mr. Speaker. We say that's immensely beneficial in the case of an Airbus, Mr. Speaker. The Airbus company, which had its products parts produced in other nations, other European nations, and that it gained a very, very highly efficient production line, and that it gained, and in consequence of this very productive industry itself, that it gained a comparative advantage over even Boeing, which is the #1 leading competitive company in the field of air industry, Mr. Speaker. We say that this is not an exclusive case to the Airbus, but rather for the other society, for other companies inside the Eurozone as well, Mr. Speaker. Second of all, there's also political benefits. Why is this so? That's what the government has wrongly characterized, is that there's going to be political clashes and these kinds of intermittent conflicts between these nations. First of all, we say that in any society, that conflicts would happen and occur, but it'll be an impetus to move the society into a better direction, Mr. Speaker. And that what they're saying is that they're implying that, well, if it's the purpose of the Eurozone to have no conflict, no conflict should occur, and if a conflict occurs, it's going against their principle. We say that's very, very childish logic to say so, Mr. Speaker, that conflicts do occur due to the interest and characteristics of the nations themselves, but it's the principle of the European Union to move, even if conflicts occur, to move the European Union into a better direction, Mr. Speaker. And by doing so, we say that the incentive of the European Union is political, in which sense that economic union, economic ties between nations, makes it hard for other European nations to opt out of the relationship of other European nations. Hence, political interconnectedness would be bound to increase, Mr. Speaker. So having said, what have we told you? We told you that the entire problem of the European Union was not caused by the one cause of the European currency, but rather as a structural problem within the European nations that have the problem itself, Mr. Speaker, and that there is immense political and economic benefits in the European Union that have been either neglected or have been overshadowed by the massive controversy over whether whether these nations should opt out of the European Union itself. So hence, we do not regret the European Union, but see it as a political entity will drive the world into a better direction. So we beg to oppose. Thank you. And wow.
You have spoken for 11 minutes.
Anyways,
You shouldn't do that.
I mean, I don't know.
Huh?
I don't know.
No, you should. You really shouldn't. 11. That's too much.
Anyways. Go.
Okay, so let's clear up the leader of opposition's argument. What they're saying basically is that this is not a problem of euro, but this is fundamentally a structural problem inside the European nations, that euro is actually a very, very good thing, but it's actually wrongly accused of being harmful to the society.
Exactly.
However, we did not hear any argument coming from the opposition side talking to us about the monetary policy, which was indeed the proposition side's first main principal argument, claiming why the usage of euro itself cannot but be harmful for all nations of eurozone. Maybe they have attacked the second point regarding practical harms that the euro gives to developing nations, but we believe that because our fundamental point about monetary policy is what stands currently, and also we do not even believe that their points have actually fully attacked our second point. We believe that our point stands still, while the opposition side point does not exist. So, starting from the first, we believe that the opposition side have averted the point about the monetary policy. We have explained fully how these usage of euro is actually taking away the rights taking away the sovereignty of these nations regarding the monetary policy of these nations. And what the only response from the opposition side was that it is actually an innate problem of industry, and fiscal policy is not actually efficient because of Greece and how much black market is taking part of in Greece economy and blah blah blah. And we believe that this is also a contradiction coming from the opposition side themselves. Why? Because actually the second point coming from the opposition side was actually proving why fiscal policy is not very effective in current status quo. And thankfully, the opposition side has proved fully why fiscal policy itself is not working very well. Then what does that mean? That means that we need monetary policy also. Then, in that situation, which side model do you think proves better regarding the harms and benefits of euro? The opposition side, who has gave us no example, but only the Airbus example, which I will further rebut in the current status quo, or the proposition side, who has fully explained as one single main argument, telling you why it is harmful to lose the rights regarding monetary policy. I believe that it is the proposition side, of course. And regarding the Airbus point, we believe that the Airbus industry, or any kinds of those kind of interconnectedness of countries is something that can be achieved even without a common currency. For instance, we believe that the ASEAN, I don't know how to spell it, ASEAN, or the ASEAN, whatever, regarding the Asian country, East Asian or Northeast Asian countries are actually very very successful in these kind of economic trades or economic relations, and hence we believe that Europe, the benefit they have mentioned is not actually an exclusive benefit, but rather we believe that that is indeed something that's very the interconnectedness of these euro common currency is indeed a harm to the society. This will be further explained in the third point of our of the proposition side. But still, let's have a look at some points made by the opposition side. Well, the opposition side seems to be believing that all the problem currently the pigs, the Greece, and the European Eurozone countries are going under is actually innate problem of the industry. Maybe that is true. Maybe the industry, it is the industry's fault, maybe because they are too much dependent on tourists. However, we believe that's not true. Why? Because we have seen many cases why the as they have fully mentioned, the tourist industry itself cannot but be very very fluctuating and cannot but be unstable in not only today but also in past days, which means that the European nations have gone through all the fluctuation and all the instability until now, and we believe that
POI, sir.
no, why is it that now these kind of problems occurred? We believe that that is because of the usage of euro. So we have, so for example, in 2010 when Athens joined the euro, there has been 2% decrease in tourism in Athens, which means that the loss of tourism industry itself is not only about that it's instability or fluctuations, but rather also about the usage of euro and how euro actually undermines these rights of these countries, these countries' ability to take care of their monetary policies, and these countries, as the first speaker explained, how the usage of euro can actually undermine the competitiveness of these countries by actually raising their currency. So, having said that, we believe that we have fully rebutted to the opposition side's points regarding how euro is not actually the cause of the current economic crisis in the European nations, and how actually fiscal policy is very not effective in itself, which is actually proving our point. And we have also pointed out how the opposition side was very irresponsible in dealing with the monetary policy point, and I would like the deputy leader of opposition to come out and state their actually stance about how the monetary policy point that we have mentioned. Now, moving on to the third argument. So we have to answer how did euro create domino effect? And we believe, so starting from what is domino effect, we believe the domino effect is very very literal in its words, because we believe that domino effect is just like domino. If one country falls, the country next to it falls with the country. Why? Because we believe that the euro created too a high interconnectedness between these countries, that if one country fails, the credibility of the other nation cannot but fall, which results in no investments, and eventually everyone dies. And of course, this is a kind of an extreme situation, but actually this is indeed what is happening in the status quo. So I would like to analyze the status quo for Mr. Speaker and the opposition side. So we believe that the opposition side is also aware of the PIGS nations, PIIGS, who are under the extreme indebtedness situation. So for example, the Greece is currently having deficit which is as big as 9.8% of their whole GDP and 94.6% of their public sector debt. This is highest in the country's modern history. Well, Portugal, after Greece, was affected first, and then Spain. Although debt of the Spain is relatively low, it is considered most vulnerable economy in the current modern society. And Ireland also got screwed up because of housing boom, and the result was huge losses for France French and German banks occurred. And why is this bad? Because we believe that this is creating not only the developing nations to fall, but also the falling developing nations are dragging these developed nations, such as French and German banks, and these nations are actually getting harmed by these falling developing nations. And we believe that this is very problematic because not only the developing nations but also the developed nations are falling, and hence the whole economy of the eurozone is falling. For example, the Grexit, which is a newly derived term, um, uh, connected Greece and with exit, meaning that the threatening of Greece to exit the eurozone is actually very shows how these domino effect is very affecting these eurozone member states. So because of euro, we believe that the high interconnectedness has created these domino effects. And why is this because exclusive of euro? Because we believe that the case of 2008 U.S. economic crisis actually shows why it is the current economic crisis of the eurozone is a fault to euro actually. So basically, we believe that the 2008 USA economic crisis was as big as current European economic crisis, but we believe that it was able to recover because the countries related to USA and countries that was dealing with USA was using different currencies, which actually enabled different monetary policies and and they had less of an interconnectedness between themselves, which actually enabled them to survive these economic crises. However, because of euro, we believe that the current status quo is that all the nations of eurozone and EU is falling with the defaulting pigs nations, and we believe that that is a problem in itself. So what have we told you today? I believe that we have told you how the opposition side does not stand in the first place, and how the opposition side is actually making a contribution to the proposition side's case. And we have also explained you our third argument: how did EU create domino effect? And because of these reasons, we believe that the proposition side should stand. Thank you. 아무래도 너무 못하는 것 같아. 아, 포인트 너무 쓰레기 같았어. 솔직히 너무 쓰레기였다. 근데 리버트 포인트는 쓰레기였는데 대충 컨스트럭티브 케이스는 이 정도로 가도 될 것 같아. 그러니까 내가 설명 못한 거지. 딱히 포인트가 나쁜 건 아니거든.
그렇게.
빨리 하고 끝내. 아야.
Mr. Speaker, the proposition is mainly saying one thing. The monetary policy is the panacea for everything. That is, if nations implement their monetary policies, everything will be saved, and that they will no longer be faced with the problem that the Eurozone people, these nations, these pigs, are currently faced with. And these pigs, pigs will live happily ever after in their little farm that they're currently living in, Mr. Speaker. We say that this is totally wrong, Mr. Speaker, and that's saying that first of all, the characterization of the first speaker of the proposition itself, it doesn't justify what the second proposition the speaker says. And even though this is true, that the monetary policy itself is not a panacea, not a 만병통치약 for everything, Mr. Speaker. And even if that's the case, Mr. Speaker, that these nations, these pigs themselves, even if they had the option to do so, wouldn't be willing to implement these monetary policies in the first place, and we'll prove to you of why that would be the case. First of all, what did the speaker of the proposition say in his first speech, Mr. Speaker? Well, there are two policies to regulate the market. First, monetary policy and fiscal policy. Monetary policies are implemented by the central bank, and that the fiscal policy is what the government does. Now, they lost control of the monetary policy. That's really harmful. Problem, why? Because they lost the way of regulating their economy. What is the exclusive harm and benefit, Mr. Speaker? We say that
Point, sir.
what is the exclusive benefit they have stated here, Mr. Speaker, and that we see no distinguishment of no effectiveness difference, Mr. Speaker, of between the monetary policy and the fiscal policy characteristics they are giving us today, Mr. Speaker. Let's say that even monetary policy was effective, Mr. Speaker. Let's say that what they said was true. But Mr. Speaker, looking at the case of Greece alone, that they did 3 bailouts, Mr. Speaker, and that the European Union has been constantly telling them to try to prevent the bailout by using the best options that they currently have.
Point, sir.
Fiscal policy. Second of all, by trying to fix their structural problems, by trying to increase diversity of their industries and doing other problems as well, but solving other problems as well. But what is Greece currently doing? They're calling for another bailout, Mr. Speaker.
Exactly, sir.
And why are they doing? And what is the situation, context of them doing so? In the first and second bailout, they did absolutely nothing. They didn't change their policy. They didn't lessen the burden of economic burden of trying to implement more welfare policies and all that, Mr. Speaker.
Exactly,
and they
sir.
haven't solved the problem of corruption, Mr. Speaker. And what they're doing is trying to get more money for these nations in the first place. We see that this unwillingness itself is exactly the problem in what we see in this debate, Mr. Speaker. So we're saying that we're not saying that the eurozone. We're not saying that we're not in this debate. We're not talking about the legitimacy of the eurozone, Mr. Speaker, but rather we're talking about whether the euro caused this kind of situation. We don't care if like these nations use other methods of the euro to try to distort the European Union, Mr. Speaker. That would be outside of another debate, Mr. Speaker. We're saying that the euro didn't cause the situation, but other measures, their incompatibility, to adjust with international recommendations caused the situation in the first place, Mr. Speaker. We say that they're irresponsible governments in the first place, Mr. Speaker. So having this clarified,
Point,
let's say their points about our fiscal policy, what problem they have identified in the first place. They're saying that, well, we've proven to you the inadequacy of fiscal policies, Mr. Speaker. But we say that the context, although we're in the same conclusion, the context of where they explained this was entirely different, Mr. Speaker, and that their poor analysis of their premise that saying the euros, because of the euro, of increasing the incompetitiveness of these relative competitiveness of these nations caused this problem. We're saying that these lazy, sluggish governments cause this problem of inadequate fiscal policies. The two roots are different, Mr. Speaker. Doesn't the leader proposition distinguish this? So having this addressed,
Point,
Mr.
sir.
Speaker, let's look at the problem itself. Let's
If
see.
you have nothing to say, sir.
Okay.
In that case, don't you think that it is the burden of proof for the opposition side that if the fiscal policy can actually be effective, but the problem is that the opposition side is not giving any single analysis upon how fiscal policy can actually be effective, but rather only saying that these governments are so sluggish and lazy that they're not even carrying out the fiscal policy. But don't you think that in that case it is problematic because they don't have any alternative method called the monetary policy?
So, Mr. Speaker, that will be dealt with our substantive case, Mr. Speaker, which was supposed to be addressed by the first speaker, which with time elapsed he couldn't address. So having this said, let's move on to the other rebuttals and the dominant effect that he has characterized, Mr. Speaker. Now, the dominant effect that these nations, by the interdependency of these nations, that these poorer nations will be more dependent on these stronger, economically strong nations in order for them to, and they'll try to exploit this in order for them to gain more benefits and try to burden these nations more, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, then if it wasn't, we say that maybe this would be true. Maybe that these nations, there will be a burden for these nations as well, Mr. Speaker. But let's look at the context of what this is happening, Mr. Speaker. Let's flip the coin, Mr. Speaker. What would happen if, first of all, there wasn't any combining factor between these nations at the first place, Mr. Speaker. If these nations were in their very, very hard state, where these citizens were dying because of famine, and all these structural problems that cause these economic problems within that state, why would another
Point, sir.
richer nation have a damn about this, Mr. Speaker? We say that the purpose of EURC, what it has done, it has created a community, Mr. Speaker, where other nations, though it might be burdensome, Mr. Speaker, in the short run, would
Exactly, sir.
long-term economic benefits by the interconnectedness of these nations, Mr. Speaker. And when one nation is dealt with a problem, an unexpected problem that even nations cannot predict, that there would be a guarantee, Mr. Speaker, that if you help us, and if you help us, we'll help you, Mr. Speaker. So having this characteristic set, we say that this connects the political and economic situations of these nations, and by increasing this political interconnectedness, we say it benefits benefits the nations of the European Union. So, Mr. Speaker.
Before you go on, sir.
Yes, sir.
Don't you think that the community that you have just explained is exactly the problem that exacerbated the Greece case in itself, where the Greece has actually deceived the other nations about the amount of debts that the government has already have, and increased the amount and doubled it and tripled it to a current status where it has no choice but to bail out.
So, Mr. Speaker, yeah, totally agree with that. So, yeah, I don't really like the Greek president in the first place, corruption and all that. But anyways, it's a good point, Minan. Point this out.
What?
So,
Hey, you're supposed to be against this.
so
Argue against that. You have to.
that
Answer the
is
COI.
true. Yeah, there might be problems like that, nations using this as an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, but looking at the long term of history, Mr. Speaker, what we have seen benefits, something that other organizations in the past had never achieved, Mr. Speaker, an era of peace and solidarity where nations in Europe were marred by war for over hundreds of years, and that were economically independent of each other, which caused this deadlock of sluggish development of technology and levels of quality of life, Mr. Speaker. We say that in comparison, what the Eurozone has done is remarkable, a breakthrough in history. Though it may have these costs, Mr. Speaker, of these loopholes that these nations might use, it may be a precedent in history for later organizations to follow. Britain was this example is a precedent of the European Union itself, Mr. Speaker. That is to say, the European Union is a more developed version, a more improved version of the Bretton Woods organization, Mr. Speaker. That is to say that although in the short term there are loopholes, evident loopholes there, that is, the nations can learn the lessons and develop a more stable and better and improved this organization or a peace community later on in history, Mr. Speaker. So, having this established, the overtimes again. Let's meet you at the whip. Wow.
You're not gonna do the whip.
Okay, whatever. 참, 물건하는
민예, 우리처럼 이렇게 망하면 안 돼.
이거 망한 거 아니야.
아니야, 망했어, 솔직히.
이거 망해.
솔직히 망한 거지, 이건. 이 정도면.
아유, 참.
자, 여기 한성이. 하관이가 잘 보고 잘 자고 내일 열심히 하자.